Hello, I'm Dr. Ji Dae-kyung from Seoul May Orthodontic Clinic. I hope you have been doing well and that your clear aligner treatment is progressing smoothly. Today marks our 7th session. Starting today, I will be discussing treatment strategies for Class 1 malocclusion. This will be the first lecture on the topic, and I will begin by explaining the diagnostic criteria and treatment planning. There are numerous diagnostic criteria. Among them, I would like to highlight just 2 aspects that are relevant to clear aligner treatment, an aesthetic aspect and an occlusal aspect. I will address one key aspect from each category that is especially important in relation to clear aligner treatment. When we begin clear aligner treatment, we upload the patient records to the clear aligner company's web viewer. At that stage, it is important to provide certain guidelines for the technicians and web designers so that they can develop an effective treatment plan. As you can see here, there is a midline discrepancy. We should establish the appropriate reference midline for alignment. Of course, technicians can review the facial photographs and determine it themselves, but that is not easy. When comparing the facial midline with the mandibular and maxillary midlines in the image, we can see that the mandibular midline is aligned with the facial midline. Therefore, it would be appropriate to comment, please adjust the maxillary midline to match the mandibular midline. Let's move on to the second point. It's about tooth size discrepancy. Looking at the maxillary teeth, they appear quite narrow and long. In the mandible, there is significant crowding, and dehiscence can be also observed. At first glance, the tooth size seems acceptable. When comparing the maxillary and mandibular anterior teeth, it appears there may be a size discrepancy. As expected, the analysis was based on the Bolton ratio. Normally, the anterior Bolton ratio is around 77.3%, but in this case, it was 86%, indicating that the mandibular anterior teeth are significantly larger. This provides a diagnostic basis for deciding the IPR amount on the mandibular anterior teeth, or even to consider extraction. To summarize, there are many diagnostic factors to take into account. Among them, aesthetic considerations such as symmetry, occlusal factors, and tooth size discrepancy in the maxillary anterior region play a crucial role. These considerations are essential when determining how to achieve an appropriate overjet and overbite. Let's take a look at a case. This is a relatively simple case. However, if we were to approach it with bracket-based orthodontics, it would actually be a retreatment case. This patient is not someone I previously treated, but came to see me. The patient preferred not to have any attachments placed on the teeth if possible. But once we start considering orthodontic treatment, things are not quite simple. After alignment and leveling, the central incisor, lateral incisor, and canine would be retracted together en masse. Even with such limited space, this process could take about 10 months. In this case, clear aligner treatment has the advantage of consolidating and moving the anterior teeth en masse in an efficient manner. In this case, the important point is to identify why the space has opened and whether it will reopen after treatment. On the web viewer, when comparing the initial and final setups, you may notice occlusal high spots. If such outcomes are anticipated, occlusal equilibration can be performed in advance. If the amount of occlusal adjustment is excessive, IPR of the mandibular anterior teeth can be considered to increase overjet. So, we need to ensure that we can better evaluate and diagnose the relapse and other potential issues. Now, let's move on to the treatment plan. Each part of the treatment plan could take an hour, so the entire discussion might extend to 5 or 6 hours. Today, I will briefly discuss the topic of deep bite in relation to leveling the curve of SPE. As you know, the COS, the curve of SPE, correlates directly with overbite. The deeper the mandibular curve of SPE, the more pronounced the deep bite becomes. From the perspective of leveling the occlusal plane aims to achieve proper horizontal and vertical overlap. By doing so, we can prevent premature anterior contacts and create the necessary space to resolve crowding in the mandibular dentition. Let us first look at the treatment strategies for the COS. These strategies are the same as those for managing deep bite. In cases of deep bite, where the mandibular incisors are excessively extruded, intrusion of these teeth is required. Intrusion of the mandibular anterior teeth is referred to as absolute intrusion. In this case, when the amount of incisor intrusion becomes excessive, we may consider slightly extruding the molars. This approach is known as relative intrusion, which produces an anterior intrusion effect. And finally, the proclination of the mandibular anterior teeth. Through these three types of tooth movement, we can level the curve of SPE. However, there are precautions to keep in mind. As you can see here, in cases of deep bite, the mandibular anterior teeth are extruded. As mentioned earlier, leveling should begin with these considerations in mind. This works well, but when the curve of SPE is excessively deep, we need to plan for some degree of overcorrection or over-engineering, just as we would in bracket-based orthodontics. As a result, we often request overcorrection for creating occlusal high spots in the premolar region. There are several ways to accomplish this. We can make such adjustments directly within the setup program, or more commonly, we provide written instructions. As you can see, we can write heavy contact on posterior teeth and light contact on anterior teeth. Another way to describe this, more specifically, is to request about from 0.3 to 0.5 millimeters clearance in the maxillary anterior region to create a slight open bite tendency. You can request these instructions to produce a slight open bite tendency. This approach is essentially the same as in bracket-based orthodontics, where full-size nickel titanium, TMA, or rectangular wires with a reverse curve of SPE are used. Let's take a look at a case. From the perspective of leveling the occlusal plane, you can see that this is a deep bite. And there is a certain degree of crowding. The deep bite is quite pronounced, though it is not a particularly difficult case. As you can see, there is also occlusal plane canting. This makes the case more challenging. Now, let's take a look at how the treatment plan was developed by reviewing the web viewer. As you can see, the initial condition showed both deep bite and crowding. It is important to carefully examine the anterior region, as well as the occlusal surfaces of the posterior teeth. Now, let's take a look at the mandible. As you can see, the initial condition showed a deep bite. During the process of leveling the curve of SPE, the amount of intrusion in the mandibular anterior teeth is clearly excessive. There was no application of over-engineering or overcorrection. Second, let's look at the original condition of the second premolars, which were lingually inclined. You can see that buccoversion occurs first in the maxillary teeth, and the same movement subsequently appears in the mandibular teeth. This is not something that makes treatment impossible, but such issues may lead to TFO. As you have seen, the initial setup in the web viewer often requires modifications. In such cases, I usually request adjustments, such as adding some over-engineering and modifying the staging because occlusal interference is anticipated in the premolar region on the left side. After these requests are made, I receive the revised setup in video form and then proceed with confirmation. At this point, the aligners are delivered, and we deliver the aligners to the patient. In resolving the curve of SPE, we also aim for extrusion of the premolars. At the same time, the lingually inclined second premolars are moved into buccoversion without any time delay. As you can see, this case was successfully managed over 11 months using 41 aligners. This case turned out well, but if it had been treated with brackets, given the perspective of managing deep bite, one might wonder whether it could have been completed within the same time frame. So, how was it for you? This concludes our first session on treatment strategies for Class 1 Malocclusion. I hope today's discussion has been helpful, and I look forward to meeting you again in the remaining 3 sessions. Thank you.